Imagine a world where 1/3 of everyone you know is dead. Your neighbors, your friends, your family. This wasn't a nightmare. It was the horrifying reality of the 14th century, a time when a mysterious and deadly plague swept across Europe, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. This was the Black Death, a pandemic that didn't just kill people, it shattered an entire belief system, shook the foundations of the most powerful institution of the time, the Catholic Church, and ultimately changed the course of history forever. How could a society so deeply rooted in faith cope when God himself seemed to have turned against them? This is the story of faith, fear, and the ultimate test of an institution that once held absolute power over the hearts and minds of millions. In the mid-1300s, when the Black Death began its terrifying march across Europe, people had only one lens through which to understand the world: religion. For medieval Christians, life was a constant struggle between good and evil, salvation and damnation, all orchestrated by an all-powerful God. So when this horrifying disease appeared, seemingly out of nowhere, causing fever, boils, and a swift, agonizing death, there was only one explanation that made sense. This was divine punishment. The Catholic Church, the spiritual authority of the era, reinforced this belief. Priests and bishops declared that the plague was God's wrath, a terrible retribution for humanity's endless sins: pride, greed, lust, you name it. They pointed to the Bible for proof. One doctor of the time wrote that God promised prosperity to those who keep his commandments, and plague to those who do not. The message was clear: repent or perish. For the common person, this interpretation was terrifyingly logical. It fit perfectly with their understanding of the apocalypse as described in the book of Revelation. The four horsemen, pestilence, war, famine, and death, were no longer just figures in a sacred text. They felt real, as if they were riding through the streets of every town and village. People saw the plague not as a medical crisis that could be fought, but as an inevitable prophecy unfolding before their very eyes. It was God's will, and who were they to question it? This belief bred a sense of fatalism and helplessness. If God had decided to punish the world, what could mere mortals possibly do to stop it? Faced with this divine scourge, the Catholic Church sprang into action, deploying its most trusted spiritual weapons. The first and most obvious response was prayer. Across Europe, church bells tolled day and night, calling the faithful to Mass. Processions of penitents marched through the streets, whipping themselves in a public display of sorrow, hoping to appease an angry God. Special masses for the dead were held constantly, and priests urged people to confess their sins. The church also offered a more transactional path to salvation: indulgences. These were official church documents that, for a price, were believed to pardon sins and reduce time spent in purgatory. As the plague raged, the sale of indulgences skyrocketed. Desperate people, fearing an eternity of damnation, willingly gave their last coins for a piece of paper that promised divine forgiveness. It was a spiritual insurance policy in a world consumed by death. But here's where the story takes a dark turn. None of it worked. The prayers went unanswered. The processions seemed to spread the disease even faster. People who bought indulgences died just as horribly as those who couldn't afford them. The plague didn't distinguish between the pious and the sinner. And most devastatingly, it didn't spare the clergy. Priests, monks, and nuns were on the front lines. They were the ones visiting the sick, offering last rites, and burying the dead. This put them in direct contact with the plague, and they died in staggering numbers. Entire monasteries were wiped out. In some dioceses, up to half the clergy perished. This created a massive institutional crisis. The church had to scramble to fill the empty positions, often ordaining men who were ill-prepared, uneducated, or of questionable moral character. The quality and integrity of the clergy plummeted. For the average believer, this was a profound shock. They had been taught that the clergy were God's chosen representatives on earth, holier and more protected than anyone else. Yet, They were dying just like everyone else. If God couldn't even protect his own priests, what hope was there for anyone? The spiritual shield of the church had been shattered, and with it, its prestige and authority. The institution that had promised protection and answers was revealed to be just as powerless and vulnerable as the people it was supposed to lead. This failure had catastrophic consequences for the church's relationship with its followers. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Imagine praying with all your heart, day after day, watching your loved ones die, and receiving only silence from heaven. The sense of abandonment was overwhelming. People began to question the very foundations of their faith. If God wasn't listening, was he even there? Or was the church's interpretation of God simply wrong? This growing disillusionment was fertile ground for new ideas. The blind allegiance that the church had commanded for centuries began to crumble. People started to think for themselves, seeking a more personal, direct connection to God, one that didn't require an intermediary who had so clearly failed them. This shift in thinking didn't happen overnight, but the seeds of doubt planted during the Black Death would grow over the next century and a half, eventually blossoming into the Protestant Reformation. Thinkers like Martin Luther would later challenge the church's authority, and they found an audience that was already skeptical and looking for alternatives. On top of its spiritual failures, the church's reputation was further tarnished by corruption. While many clergymen acted heroically, others saw the crisis as an opportunity for personal gain. Reports spread of priests charging exorbitant fees to perform last rites or say masses for the dead. The church, as an institution, continued to collect tithes and accumulate wealth from the estates of plague victims, appearing greedy and indifferent to the suffering of the people. This hypocrisy was not lost on the public. They saw an institution that preached piety while practicing avarice. For many, this was the final straw. They felt betrayed. The combination of the church's powerlessness against the plague and its perceived moral corruption led to a mass exodus of faith, not necessarily from God, but from the institution of the Catholic Church. People began exploring other spiritual paths. Some turned to mysticism, seeking a direct experience of the divine. Others embraced a more secular worldview, focusing on human reason and life on earth rather than the afterlife. The Black Death didn't just kill millions. It mortally wounded the absolute authority of the medieval church, paving the way for a new world of religious diversity, scientific inquiry, and individual conscience. It was a brutal, agonizing rebirth for Western civilization. Looking back, the Black Death was a crucible that tested faith to its absolute limit. It exposed the vulnerabilities of a powerful institution and forced people to confront their deepest beliefs about life, death, and the divine. The Catholic Church's response, rooted in a medieval worldview, was ultimately no match for the biological reality of a pandemic. The failure to stop the plague or even explain it convincingly led to a permanent decline in its authority, and set in motion the forces that would reshape the religious and intellectual landscape of Europe forever. It's a powerful reminder that even the most entrenched systems of belief can be shaken by crisis, and that in the face of overwhelming tragedy, humanity will always search for new answers, new paths, and new hope. The world that emerged from the shadow of the plague was one where blind faith was replaced by critical questioning, a change that continues to shape our modern world today. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this journey into the past fascinating, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our history. Let me know in the comments what you think. Could any institution survive a crisis of that magnitude? See you in the next video.